My dear friends, I am so glad you found your way here. As we sit together in the quiet of this moment, I want to be very open with you. To bring these reflections to life for our community, I've used modern tools, AI technology, to help craft the voice and the images you see. My heart's intent, however, is purely human, to share a journey of faith that has sustained me through 7 decades. This isn't a lecture, and I certainly don't claim to hold a monopoly on the truth. This is simply my story, a collection of moments from a life lived under the grace of God. If your experience differs, or if you find peace in another way, I truly hope you'll share that with us in the comments. We are all just travelers looking for the light. When the clock strikes midnight, the world changes. I often think back to my mother's house in the countryside of Virginia. As a boy, I'd sometimes wake up in the dead of night, the house creaking like an old ship. I would see a sliver of warm, yellow light spilling from under the kitchen door. When I'd peek in, there she was. My mother, sitting at the small wooden table, her hands wrapped around a faded blue mug, her Bible open to the Psalms. She wasn't crying, and she wasn't asking for a miracle to fall from the ceiling. She was simply keeping the watch. She used to tell me, "Son, when the world goes quiet, that's when the thin places open up. It's when the noise of the day stops shouting so you can finally hear the whisper of the Almighty." That image of her, the soft glow of a single lamp against the vast darkness of the woods outside, stayed with me. Midnight is a sacred appointment. Matthew 25 mentions a cry heard at midnight. "Behold, the bridegroom is coming." I've realized over the years that this isn't just about an ending, it's about a beginning. It is the hour when the veil between what we see and what is eternal grows thin. I don't believe there is a magical spell in the hour itself, but there is something profound about the sacrifice of sleep. When you give up your rest to seek the Creator, you are telling your soul that there is something more vital than comfort. You are stepping onto the watchtower. I invite you to think of this time not as a burden or a chore, but as a secret garden where only you and the Father walk. In the chapters to come, I want to tell you about the people I've known who found their greatest strength when the sun was nowhere to be seen. These are real stories of real struggles, not fairy tales of instant wealth or effortless cures, but honest accounts of how a midnight cry can realign a broken heart. I'd like to tell you about a man named Elias. He was a neighbor of mine years ago, a tall, quiet man with hands as rough as tree bark from 40 years of working the night shift at the local mill. When Elias retired, he found himself in a strange predicament. His body was so conditioned to the dark hours that he couldn't sleep when the rest of the world did. He'd sit on his porch at 2 a.m., watching the silent street, feeling like a ghost in his own neighborhood. One morning, over a cup of black coffee, Elias confessed to me, "I feel invisible. The world is moving on, and I'm just sitting here in the shadows." I remembered my mother's kitchen table, and I suggested to him that perhaps he wasn't invisible, but rather, he had been drafted. I told him, "Elias, maybe you aren't just awake, maybe you're on duty. You spent your life watching over a machine in a mill. Maybe now, you're meant to watch over the souls in this town while they sleep." He took that to heart. Elias started a midnight rhythm. He didn't use fancy words or theological jargon. He would sit in his old recliner, the rhythmic ticking of his grandfather clock, the only sound in the room, and he would simply talk to God. He told me he started by praying for the houses he could see from his window. He'd pray for the young couple struggling with their first baby, for the widow whose light stayed on too late, and for the teenagers he knew were searching for their way. What Elias found wasn't a sudden surge of energy or a physical miracle. Instead, he found that the loneliness that used to ache in his chest began to fill with a strange, solemn purpose. He wasn't a lonely old man anymore. He was a watchman. He realized that in the stillness, the voice he had been trying to hear during the noisy daytime was actually a whisper that required silence to be understood. I learned something watching Elias. The rhythm of the watchman isn't about how loud you pray or how many scriptures you quote. It's about the availability of the heart. When you show up at midnight, you are offering God the one thing that is truly yours: your time and your attention. For those of you who find yourselves awake in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, I want to suggest that you aren't alone. You might just be hearing the call to step onto the walls of your own city and keep the watch. It's a quiet life, but it's one filled with a dignity that the daylight hours rarely offer. There is a specific kind of weight that only a parent carries. The heavy, constant pulling of the spirit that doesn't stop just because the sun goes down. I remember a young woman from our congregation named Sarah. She was a dedicated mother, the kind who never missed a school play or a Sunday service. But life has a way of taking turns we don't plan for. Her son, a boy she had raised with every ounce of love she possessed, had wandered into a very dark woods. He was caught in a cycle of rebellion and choices that were slowly stripping away the person she knew him to be. Sarah came to me once, her eyes rimmed with red, looking like she hadn't slept in a week. "I've talked until I'm blue in the face," she whispered. "I've begged, I've pleaded, and I've argued. But the more I pull, the further he runs." I told her what I've learned in my own long life. Sometimes, when you can no longer speak to someone, you have to speak for them in the courtrooms of heaven. Sarah began what she called her midnight battle. Every night, when the house was silent and her son was out somewhere in the night, she would sit at her kitchen table. She told me she would place an empty chair across from her, imagining her son sitting there, and then she would pray. She didn't pray for him to be punished, or even for him to behave. She prayed for the chains to creak. She asked God to make the life he was leading feel uncomfortable, to let the darkness lose its flavor, and for a hedge of protection to surround him where she couldn't reach. She did this for months. There were no lightning bolts, no sudden phone calls. But Sarah changed. She found that by fighting at midnight, she stopped fighting with him during the day. She became a harbor of peace instead of a storm of anxiety. And eventually, the creaking began. Her son came home one night, not because he was forced, but because he said he felt a tug he couldn't explain, a sudden, overwhelming desire for the safety of his mother's kitchen. I tell you this because some of you are fighting for your children, your grandchildren, or your friends. You feel helpless because your words fall on deaf ears. But remember, the ears of the Father are never closed. When you stand in the gap at midnight, you are wielding a spiritual authority that transcends physical distance. You aren't just reciting words, you are engaging in a labor of love that can shake the very foundations of a stronghold. It may not happen tonight, and it may not happen tomorrow, but there is power in the persistence of a soul that refuses to sleep until it has seen the light. I'd like to introduce you to a man I'll call Mr. Henderson. He owned a small hardware store downtown, the kind of place where the floorboards groaned and the air smelled of sawdust and oil. For 30 years, he was the pillar of our community. But then came a season of economic drought. A big chain store opened up on the highway, and slowly, the bell on Mr. Henderson's door stopped ringing. The ledgers turned red, and the stress began to carve deep lines into his face. He told me later that he spent his nights pacing the hallway, calculating numbers in his head, until his brain felt like it was on fire. "I was begging God for a check in the mail," he admitted. "I was looking for a rescue, not a relationship." But one Tuesday, around 3 a.m., he was so exhausted that he simply sat down on the floor of his living room and stopped talking. In that financial midnight, something shifted. He stopped asking for the mountain to move and started asking for the wisdom to climb it. In the stillness, away from the panic of the ringing telephone and the pile of bills, a quiet thought came to him, a strategy. He realized he couldn't compete with the big stores on price, but he could provide something they couldn't: specialized repair services for the old Victorian homes in our area. He began to pray for heavenly strategies. He sought a clarity that only comes when the static of the world is muted. He didn't find a bag of gold on his doorstep the next morning, but he found a path. He restructured his business, focused on his unique strengths, and slowly, the tide began to turn. Mr. Henderson taught me that the midnight hour isn't just for emotional comfort, it's for divine intelligence. When our finances are crumbling, our first instinct is to panic, but panic is a thief of wisdom. If you are lying awake tonight, worrying about your bank account or your mortgage, I encourage you to stop the frantic mental math. Sit in the quiet. Ask the Father not just for a miracle, but for a map. Sometimes the breakthrough we need isn't a change in our circumstances, but a change in our perspective, a divine download of wisdom that only reaches us when we are still enough to receive it. I have a distant cousin named Clara, a woman with a memory like a library and a heart that felt every ripple of family history. One evening, sitting on her porch as the crickets began their nightly chorus, she told me something I'll never forget. She felt that certain shadows in her life weren't actually hers, they were echoes. She spoke of a lingering melancholy that had followed the women in our family for 3 generations, a ghost of anxiety that seemed to pass down along with the silver and the old photographs. Clara decided that these echoes had to stop with her. She began using the quiet of the midnight hour to look back through the family line. She would light a single candle and sit with our old family album, looking at the black and white faces of grandmothers and aunts she had never met. She wasn't just reminiscing, she was praying backward. She told me, "I'm not a theologian, but I know that time doesn't limit God." I started asking him to go back into those old stories and speak peace where there was trauma, and to break the silence where there was shame. Clara's midnight vigils weren't about changing the past, but about changing the inheritance she would leave for her own grandchildren. She was declaring that the patterns of the past were not the prophecies of the future. As the weeks passed, I saw a lightness in Clara I hadn't seen before. She stopped bracing herself for a disaster that never came. She found a profound peace in the realization that through prayer she could stand as a gatekeeper for her bloodline. Many of you might feel like you're carrying a heavy suitcase filled with things you didn't pack, old family hurts, patterns of addiction, or a spirit of fear that seems to run in the family. I want to tell you that midnight is the perfect time to unpack. In that sacred space, you can ask the Father to realign your spiritual DNA. You don't have to be a victim of your history. By standing in the gap during the silent hours, you can be the one who turns the tide, ensuring that the legacy you leave behind is one of faith and freedom rather than shadows and echoes. I once knew a nurse named Martha. She worked the graveyard shift in the oncology ward for nearly 30 years, a place where the air always felt thin and the hallway lights hummed with a sterile, lonely persistence. Martha was a woman of quiet grit. She'd seen a lot of people face their darkest nights, literally and figuratively, and she once told me that the clock between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. is when the physician of the night walks the halls. She told me about a patient, an elderly gentleman who had grown bitter and terrified as his health declined. One night, Martha found him staring at the door, his breathing shallow. He looked at her and whispered, "The night is so long, Martha, I feel like I'm already gone." Martha didn't give him a sermon, she simply sat by his bed, held his hand, and began to pray under her breath, a soft, rhythmic hum of peace. She wasn't praying for a medical impossibility to be written on his chart. She was praying for his spirit to be healed. She asked that the fear would leave his bones, and that the peace that surpasses understanding would settle over him like a warm blanket. The man eventually fell into a deep, restful sleep. The next morning, he didn't have a miracle cure, but he had a miracle of the heart. The bitterness had evaporated. He spent his remaining days at peace, reconciling with his children and smiling at the nurses. Martha's stories taught me that midnight is often when our physical bodies are weakest, but our spirits are most receptive to the touch of the divine. If you are struggling with your health tonight, or if you are sitting by the bedside of someone you love, know that the great physician doesn't keep office hours. He doesn't need the sun to be up to work. I don't believe that every prayer results in a physical healing we can see with our eyes, and I would never promise you that. But I do know that in the stillness of the night, there is an internal healing that can take place. It's a restoration of the soul that makes the body's burden easier to bear. When the world is asleep and the pain feels loudest, that is exactly when the physician is closest. You don't need a long list of words. Sometimes just a whisper of his name is enough to invite his peace into the room. I'd like to share a story about my old neighbor, Jack. Now, Jack was a man of logic and blueprints, a retired engineer who believed only in what he could measure with a ruler or calculate on a slide rule. He wasn't a religious man. In fact, he'd often joke that prayer was just a way for people to talk to themselves without feeling lonely. But life has a way of bringing even the most practical men to their knees. A few years ago, Jack went through a season of profound loss. Within 6 months, he lost his wife of 40 years and his eldest brother. The silence in his house became a physical weight, a ringing in his ears that wouldn't stop. One winter night, the heat in his house failed, and as he sat shivering in the dark, the logic he had leaned on his whole life seemed to crumble. Out of a mixture of anger and absolute desperation, Jack did something he hadn't done since he was a child. He slid out of his chair and let his knees hit the cold hardwood floor. He told me later, with a bit of a bashful smile, "I didn't even know who I was talking to. I just started yelling into the dark. I told God, if he was there, that I was tired, I was broken, and I didn't see the point in waking up for another sunrise." It wasn't a holy prayer. It was raw, honest, and filled with the kind of grit you only find at 3 a.m. Jack didn't see a vision or hear a booming voice, but as he sat there on that cold floor, a strange sensation washed over him, a sudden, quiet knowing that he wasn't just shouting into an empty room. The crushing weight on his chest didn't disappear, but it shifted. It became a weight he felt he could carry. He found the strength to get up, call the repairman, and for the first time in months, he made a pot of coffee and watched the stars. I share Jack's story because some of you are like him. You might be skeptical. You might feel like your prayers are just bouncing off the ceiling. I want to tell you that God isn't offended by your honesty or your doubt. In fact, some of the most powerful midnight prayers aren't the ones filled with hallelujahs, but the ones that start with, "I don't know if you're listening, but I need help." If you find yourself on a cold floor tonight, don't worry about saying the right words. Just be honest. The creator of the universe is much more interested in your heart than your vocabulary. There was a man I met many years ago named Thomas. Thomas had been blind since his early 20s, but he had a way of seeing the world that made those of us with sight feel like we were walking in a fog. He lived in a small apartment down the hall from a friend of mine, and often, in the middle of the night, you could hear a faint, melodic humming coming from behind his door. One night, I found him sitting on a bench in the courtyard, his face tilted up toward a moon he couldn't see. I asked him, "Thomas, why do you sing when everyone else is asleep?" He laughed, a warm sound that seemed to vibrate in the cool air. "Well," he said, "when you live in the dark all the time, you learn that the dark isn't empty. It's actually full of music if you're willing to listen. I sing at midnight because that's when the noise of people's opinions and the noise of my own limitations finally dies down. I sing because Paul and Silas sang in their prison cell at midnight, and I figure if it could shake the foundations of a jail, it can surely shake the foundations of my own blues." Thomas taught me about the midnight song. It's the kind of praise that doesn't depend on how you feel or what your bank account looks like. It's a choice. In Acts 16, Paul and Silas were beaten and shackled in the deepest part of the prison. They didn't wait for the doors to open before they started singing. They sang while they were still in chains. And the scripture says the other prisoners were listening. I've realized that when we choose to praise God in our midnight hour, when we are still in the middle of our struggle, still in the dark, still waiting for the answer, that praise has a different kind of weight. It's a spiritual weapon. It tells the darkness that it doesn't own you. If you are feeling trapped tonight, maybe by anxiety, or a sense of failure, or a physical limitation, try humming a song of thanks. Even if your voice trembles, even if you don't feel joyful, there is a supernatural authority in a song sung in the dark. It creates a crack in the fortress of your circumstances, letting the light of heaven begin to seep through. I want to tell you about Sister Beatrice. She was the oldest member of our congregation, a woman who seemed to carry a piece of the sunrise in her eyes, even when she was 90. Beatrice had a ritual for her midnight hours. She told me once that she didn't just fall into prayer. She prepared for it like she was expecting a guest of the highest honor. Every night, if she found herself awake at 2 a.m., she would slowly rise, put on a warm robe, and brew a small pot of chamomile tea. She'd clear her kitchen table and lay out her Bible and a small, leather-bound notebook. "You see," she explained to me, "I'm not just waiting for God to show up. I'm showing him that I've made a place for him." She called it preparing the altar. Beatrice taught me that the midnight hour isn't just about what we get from God, it's about the discipline of the heart. She wasn't looking for a vibration or a goosebump. She was looking for communion. Sometimes she would sit for an hour and never say a single word. She'd just watch the steam rise from her tea, which she said reminded her of the prayers of the saints rising like incense. In that stillness, she found a clarity that allowed her to navigate the challenges of aging with a grace that was nearly supernatural. Many of us treat prayer like an emergency flare. We only fire it off when the ship is sinking. But Beatrice lived a life of constant, quiet preparation. If you are struggling to focus during these late hours, perhaps you might try creating a small altar of your own. It doesn't have to be fancy. It could be a specific chair, a favorite mug, or simply a dedicated moment of silence before you speak. By preparing the space, you are telling your mind and your spirit that this time is set apart. It moves prayer from being a desperate reaction to being a holy habit. When we honor the Father by preparing our hearts in the quiet, we find that the answers we seek often arrive not as a thunderclap, but as a steady, quiet stream of peace that nourishes us long after the sun comes up. As we come to the end of our time together, I find myself looking out my window at the very first hints of grey light on the horizon. The long night is beginning to yield to the morning. I've spent many such nights over the years, some in tears, some in silence, and some in the kind of fierce, focused prayer we've talked about tonight. And if there is one thing I have learned in my 70 years, it is this: the night never wins. The sun always rises, but the person who greets the dawn after a midnight vigil is not the same person who saw the sun set. I think back on my own life, on the times when I felt the walls closing in, or when I didn't know how I would face the next day's burdens. Those midnight hours didn't always result in a sudden change in my bank account or an immediate fix to my problems. But they changed me. They carved out a space in my soul where fear used to live and filled it with a quiet, unshakable certainty that I am not alone. I learned that my strength doesn't come from my own hands or my own cleverness, but from a source that never runs dry. I want to thank you for sitting with me in this sacred space. My hope is that these stories of my mother's lamp, of Elias the watchman, of Sarah's creaking chains, and even Jack's cold floor have reminded you that your midnight cry is a powerful, holy thing. It is a bridge between the world of shadows and the world of light. As the world begins to wake up and the noise starts to return, I invite you to carry that midnight peace with you. Don't let it evaporate with the morning dew. If you felt a tug on your heart tonight, or if you have a story of your own divine appointment in the dark, I truly hope you'll share it with us in the comments. We grow stronger when we hear how the Father is moving in each other's lives. Remember, you are more than a conqueror through Christ. Your breakthrough is not a matter of if, but when. He who neither slumbers nor sleeps is watching over you even now. Walk into your day with your head held high, knowing that the God who met you in the dark is the same God who will lead you through the light. Until we meet again, may His peace be your shield and His love be your constant guide. Amen.